Most civilizations do not fall in a single moment. They decline gradually, over decades or even centuries, as small problems compound into structural weakness. This is the story of how complex societies unravel, not through sudden catastrophe, but through the slow erosion of the systems that sustain them. The process often begins with environmental strain. When populations grow beyond what the land can comfortably support, food production becomes precarious. Soil exhaustion, deforestation, or shifts in rainfall patterns reduce agricultural yields. Farmers work harder for smaller harvests. Granaries that once overflowed now struggle to fill. The margin for error shrinks with each passing season. Economic pressures follow closely behind. As resources become scarcer, maintaining infrastructure grows more expensive. Roads fall into disrepair. Irrigation channels silt up. The cost of administering distant territories rises while tax revenues decline. Governments face difficult choices: raise taxes and risk unrest, or reduce services and watch the system deteriorate. Administrative complexity becomes a burden rather than an advantage. Bureaucracies that once coordinated vast territories now consume resources without solving underlying problems. Officials multiply, each layer adding cost and delay. Simple tasks require approval from multiple authorities. The distance between those who govern and those who are governed widens. Social cohesion weakens as conditions worsen. When the state cannot guarantee basic security or fairness, people invest in local networks instead. Wealthy families build private estates with their own guards and granaries. Communities turn inward, trusting their neighbors more than distant administrators. The sense of shared identity that once bound the civilization together fragments into competing interests. Evidence from archaeological sites reveals these patterns. Researchers find that construction quality declines in later periods. Public buildings show hasty repairs using inferior materials. Settlements shrink as people abandon marginal lands. Trade networks contract, leaving remote regions isolated. The archaeological record documents not a sudden end, but a gradual simplification. The Maya lowlands offer a clear example of this process. Between the 8th and 9th centuries, evidence indicates that agricultural lands could no longer sustain dense urban populations. Major centers were gradually abandoned as people dispersed to smaller settlements. The construction of monuments ceased, and trade routes shifted northward, reflecting adaptation rather than catastrophic collapse. Institutions lose their adaptive capacity. The rules and traditions that worked during prosperous times become rigid constraints during crisis. Leaders apply old solutions to new problems. Innovation slows as resources concentrate on maintaining existing structures rather than developing new approaches. The civilization becomes locked into patterns that no longer serve it well. Historians suggest that population pressure often interacts with climate variability in damaging ways. A series of poor harvests, which might have been manageable in earlier times, triggers cascading failures in a stressed system. Food shortages lead to disease. Disease reduces the workforce. A smaller workforce cannot maintain the infrastructure. The cycle reinforces itself. External pressures compound internal weaknesses. Neighbors who once traded peacefully now probe for vulnerabilities. Not through organized invasion, but through gradual encroachment. Border regions become contested zones. The cost of defending frontiers rises while the resources to do so diminish. The civilization contracts, yielding territory it no longer has the capacity to control. Research points to the role of inequality in accelerating decline. When elites capture a disproportionate share of wealth, the tax base erodes. Essential services deteriorate, while palaces grow more elaborate. This imbalance creates resentment and reduces collective willingness to support shared institutions. The social contract frays. In many cases, collapse is not total destruction, but transformation. Cities gradually depopulate rather than burn. Administrative centers lose their coordinating function and become local settlements. Literacy may decline as the need for record-keeping diminishes. Complex trade networks dissolve into simpler, more local exchange systems. What appears as collapse from one perspective represents adaptation from another. The timeline varies considerably. Some civilizations decline over 2 or 3 generations, a process visible within living memory. Others stretch their decline across centuries, with each generation experiencing conditions only slightly worse than their parents. The pace depends on initial strength, the severity of pressures, and the effectiveness of responses. Written records, where they exist, document growing anxiety. Administrative texts become more concerned with shortages and security. Letters reveal families relocating to safer areas. Legal documents show disputes over increasingly scarce resources. The tone shifts from confidence to caution, from expansion to preservation. Understanding these patterns requires humility about historical knowledge. The evidence is fragmentary and open to interpretation. What seems obvious in retrospect was far from clear to those living through it. Many factors interact in ways that are difficult to untangle even with modern analytical tools. The lesson from multiple civilizations is consistent. Decline results from accumulated stresses rather than single causes. Environmental degradation, economic strain, administrative ossification, social fragmentation, and external pressure work together, each amplifying the others. Systems that appear stable can prove surprisingly fragile when multiple supports weaken simultaneously. These were not failures of character or intelligence. The people who lived through these transitions were as capable as any other generation. They faced problems that outpaced their institutions' ability to adapt. The structures that had enabled their civilization's rise became constraints that prevented effective response to new challenges. Civilizational decline unfolds as a gradual process, a slow unwinding of complex systems under accumulated pressure. The historical record, though incomplete, reveals patterns that transcend individual societies, environmental limits, economic burdens, institutional rigidity, and social strain working together over time. What remains clear is that collapse was rarely sudden or simple, but rather the end result of decades or centuries of compounding stresses that overwhelmed the adaptive capacity of even sophisticated societies.